So let's get back to the topic of ecosystems. Ecosystems have several important components. They are obviously a group of interdependent plants, animals, and microbes that interact with each other and their non-living environment. They're also sustained by the flow of energy through the ecosystem and by the cycling of nutrients as well. Over here, this diagram is depicting the fact that we've got different geochemical cycles that we'll be talking about in this short video series, as well as the flow of energy through the ecosystem. Let's define ecology again. Ecology is the scientific study of relationships in the natural world. It includes relationships between organisms and their physical environments. This is known as physiological ecology. It also includes relationships between organisms of the same species. This is known as population ecology. It also includes relationships between organisms of different species, which is known as community ecology. And it includes relationships between organisms and the fluxes of matter and energy through the biological system, and this is known as ecosystems ecology. Please pay attention to the two terms on the right side of the screen. Biotic parts of the environment include the living parts, or plants, animals, microbes, dead organisms, and waste products of dead organisms. The abiotic, or non-living parts of the environment include the water, the air, the nutrients, solar energy, rocks, and heat. Okay, so abiotic factors were already mentioned, and they can include sunlight, rainfall, temperature, and nutrients. Each organism can survive only within the limits of their range of tolerance. This is also known as the law of tolerance to abiotic factors. The limiting factor is typically that which restricts the growth or the reproduction of the organism. So this graphic is depicting population size on the y-axis versus temperature zones. And the optimum range of temperature appears to be in this zone, and if it gets too cold, there's a zone of physiological stress, and then eventually gets so cold that there's a zone of intolerance, that those organisms will not survive in that type of temperature. And then you have the water temperature increasing and getting warmer, and you have a zone of physiological stress in the warmer temperature range, to the point that it gets so warm that no organisms will live for that particular fish species. So each species can have a limiting factor to sunlight, rainfall, temperature, or even nutrients, and it determines the growth or reproduction of that particular species. So the biotic components of the ecosystem, the figure on the right depicts the structural components of an ecosystem, and it shows how energy is transferred and nutrient cycling occurs. So we're going to define a few quick terms here. Producers, also known as autotrophs, are typically plants that go through the photosynthesis process to make nutrients. Consumers, or heterotrophs, rely on aerobic respiration and will feed on other organisms and their remains. Now, consumers can be herbivores, which primarily are plant eaters, or they can be carnivores, which are meat eaters, and then they could be omnivores, which eat both plants and meat. We also have the decomposers as part of this cycle as well. So, energy is going to flow through the ecosystem via food chains and food webs. And the different levels in the food chain or food web is known as a trophic level. The quality of energy available to organisms will decrease at each successive trophic level, and that's because much of the energy is lost moving from one level to the next. This figure depicts the food chain and also the chemical energy and nutrients and how they flow through the various trophic levels. The arrows show how chemical energy and nutrients flow from one level to the next, and as you can see, we have the producers at the first trophic level, which are plants relying on photosynthesis. Then we have the primary consumers at the second trophic level, the secondary consumers at the third trophic level, and then the tertiary consumers at the fourth trophic level. And then when any of these die, there is a component of decomposers and detritus feeders which help break down their organic material and recycle back through the system. This is a diagram that's depicting a simplified food web. It's one that correlates to the southern hemisphere, and in the middle area here where it's shaded, this is an even simpler food chain that is part of this complex food web. And I'm just going to reiterate that basically there's a simple overall feeding pattern which involves a series of levels that I mentioned earlier as trophic level. And again, producers are on the first trophic level. And these are typically our photosynthesizers on this first trophic level. Typically your herbivores or primary consumers feed directly on the producers and are on the second trophic level. These consumers would not exist without the producers. And then your carnivores feed on other consumers that are on the third trophic level, and most secondary consumers are animals, but there's a few like the Venus flytrap that actually trap and digest insects. Typically there are only 3 or 4 trophic levels in an ecosystem, and that's because biomass decreases with each increase in trophic level, and there's a loss of energy associated with each increase in trophic level as well. So please remember that there's typically only 3 or 4 trophic levels in an ecosystem. This figure shows a decrease in the usable energy that's available at each succeeding trophic level in the food chain or the food web. The pyramid shows why the Earth can support more people if we eat at lower trophic levels, just by consuming grains and veggies and fruits directly, rather than passing through another trophic level and basically feeding on meat that consumed these grains and vegetables and fruits. I do want to define the term biomass. Biomass is the total combined dry weight of all organisms at each trophic level. In a land ecosystem, the biomass is 90% less at each higher trophic level, which is depicted here. So the biomass will decrease by 90% when you go from the first trophic level to the second trophic level. It will decrease again another 90% as you go from the second trophic level to the third trophic level. So again, please remember that the biomass decreases by 90% as you move up the food chain in trophic levels. Also, the more trophic levels that are present in a food chain, the greater the total loss of usable energy, as energy flows from one trophic level to the next. Please recall that that loss occurs via heat. So, to summarize this, the simpler the food chain, the more food energy is available to the top level consumers. So, some ecosystems can produce plant matter faster than others. And this brings in 2 key terms that you need to be familiar with. Gross primary productivity, or GPP. This is the rate that an ecosystem's producers convert energy into biomass. And net primary productivity, or NPP. This is the rate that producers use photosynthesis to produce and store chemical energy, minus the rate at which they use energy for aerobic respiration. NPP limits the total number of organisms that can be supported by Earth's life support system. So let's look at a couple different types of ecosystems and compare their net primary productivity. So looking at this graph, what are nature's 3 most productive and nature's 3 least productive systems. Well, if you're looking at the terrestrial ecosystems, the 3 most productive from a standpoint of MPP are swamps, marshes, tropical rainforests, and temperate forests. If you're just looking at the aquatic ecosystems, the most productive is the estuaries. And estuaries are those zones along our coastal areas where there's a mixture of freshwater and saltwater. The least productive include extreme desert, desert scrub, and tundra in terms of terrestrial land ecosystems. And then from the aquatic standpoint, the open ocean is considered the least productive. Now, in regards to the open ocean, despite their low net primary productivity, oceans do produce most of the world's biomass because of their vast size. Tropical rainforests have a high net primary productivity, yet much is lost through natural capital degradation. So there are some circumstances that do cause variations in these net primary productivity values.